we're going to move here now to another issue regarding the Trump administration, and that, of course, is the issue of deportations. A lot to be said there. Very happy to be joined here once again by Zoe Alexandra, who is the editor of People's Dispatch. Zoe, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great to have you. Well, the big story, of course, this week, vis-a-vis the various deportation issues, is the deportation of a number of Venezuelans, not to Venezuela, but to El Salvador, where they have been taken in by Nayib Bukele, who's the president there. We're seeing a picture there on the screen of this prison that they're being sent to. Let me just start here, Zoe. I mean, what do we actually know about the people who were deported? Because, of course, the way it's being presented is that they're all these, like, violent Venezuelan gang members, but I've seen some news that people are disputing that that is, everyone who is involved in this. Obviously, you can't speak for every individual person, but, what do we know about some of those basic facts about how this is being justified?
Yeah, well, I just want to start by saying that I think what Rania just said about the deportation of, Palestine activists and the detention and repression using immigration law is happening at the same time that immigration law is being also weaponized in this case. So, for example, these Venezuelan migrants who you're seeing on the screen right now are essentially accused of being foreign enemies, part of Tren de Aragua, which is, in Trump's mind, this gang that's invading the United States. And in the executive order where he kind of invokes the Alien Enemies Act, he says that Tren de Aragua is being used by the Nicolas Maduro government to overthrow and destabilize the government. So first of all, using the most explosive and divisive and just crazy rhetoric to completely misrepresent the situation. There's no invasion of the United States, and there's definitely no attempt by the Venezuelan government to use a gang which it fought against for a decade to eradicate in Venezuela, to overthrow the U.S. government. So, the first thing I'd say is that the premise for everything that's happened since then is insane and completely invented, falsified, trumped up. And then you have essentially around 250 Venezuelans who are accused, again, by the Trump administration, by immigration authorities, of being part of this gang, which has different, what is Tren de Aragua is a really great question. We don't need to get into that right now, but these 250 people who were rounded up are not part of Tren de Aragua. Some of them might be, many of them are not. They're tattoo artists, they're musicians, they're Venezuelan migrants who were maybe denied asylum. They're basically Venezuelan migrants, largely men who are in the system, who immigration authorities knew about, who maybe have tattoos, and who basically racially fit the profile of what they want to construe as this image of these violent criminals and these gang types that they want to kind of paint to the U.S. public that they're going after. But, there's many, many stories coming out. Family members in Venezuela who have come and testified, who have said in rallies and interviews that they had no idea what happened to their sons, and they appear in these images, and they say, there's stories of one guy who was a musician who lived in Chile for many years, who was a migrant there, and then who went to the US. He was a musician. He got picked up. He didn't have his, I think it seemed like his asylum application did not go through. We know many people actually lost status because TPS was revoked. That's an entirely, that's also part of this attack, but it's humble workers who are just now being rounded up. And again, it's really based on these kind of archaic and what seemed like was in maybe a past decade of, oh, they have tattoos, they're gang members. But that's literally why some of these people were rounded up. And so there's many tragic stories coming out of people having no idea where their family members are, and now not knowing how long they're going to be held in El Salvador, what kind of conditions they're going to be held in. There's talk of the fact that they'll be subjected to forced labor. Nayib Bukele has already kind of hinted at this. I even heard today a case of someone who's I won't go into details because it's actually quite sensitive, but they had no idea where their son was. Half of the family is asylum seekers, and now they're just scrambling to figure out what happened and if there's any way to get in touch, if there's any way to actually get them out of this situation. But it's a really unprecedented because we're not only talking about people being rounded up, accused of being foreign terrorist organization members of a foreign terrorist organization, which Tren de Aragua has now been designated as, but also being sent to a third country where they have no what rights are they being held under? What legal status do they have there? All of this is ambiguous and completely uncharted territory.
It's really horrifying, shocking, unprecedented. Just the destruction of people's lives and then the not knowing if it's ever going to be over. But Zoe, I didn't realize this. You mentioned, so there's temporary protected status, which Venezuelans qualified for until like recently. So you're saying, sorry, I just want to clarify, some of these people, they rounded up and said because they were overstaying their ability to be here because of temporary protected status being revoked?
So there's a lot of, I think right now, there's a lot of different kind of levels of what status people have achieved, what they have. We know that essentially for several years, the US government, in its attempts to kind of foment this rhetoric that Venezuela was in crisis because of its own socialist government. Of course, we know that Venezuela is in economic crisis because of the crippling US economic sanctions. And so the US was, again, trying to say, look, there's this mass migration happening from Venezuela because the government of Venezuela is evil, because the government of Venezuela is corrupt. And so millions of people are leaving. This was the big US talking point against Venezuela. We know that it's been used, in many different forums to as evidence of kind of the quote unquote failure of the socialist project there. And so, as we've seen in the past, the U.S., of course, weaponizes, immigration status and benefits that it can offer to certain types of immigrants to, on one hand, of course, go after its political rivals. So say, okay, we're going to give, this TPS to Venezuelan migrants if they say that they're being persecuted by the Maduro regime. And then also, of course, this is has been used in different ways, but it also kind of creates this a bit of division within the immigrant community because then certain people are afforded special rights, etc. And so essentially in the past month, the Donald Trump administration said that it was revoking TPS for a couple 100,000 Venezuelans in different phases. Some of that has started, there was one group, I think, that in this month they're going to lose status, others later on in September. But the point being that many people went to the United States under false pretenses, thinking that the US government was going to offer them, asylum status, refugee status, different, protected statuses, whether it be TPS or otherwise. And now the US government has essentially completely walked back on that, on those kind of agreements and those commitments. And these, again, sometimes it's illusions. I was looking at videos from the mobilization in Caracas, which took place, protesting these detentions and deportations. And in some testimonies, some people were saying that actually right-wing Venezuelans, like the party of Leopoldo Lopez, other right-wing parties were actually recruiting young Venezuelans to migrate to the United States. And they were actually making promises. If you go to the United States, if you leave, if you then denounce the government of Maduro, like you're going to have these specific privileges and protections. So there's a host of different reasons and different statuses that people have had in the United States, and now essentially they're turning around and saying Venezuelan migrants across the board, whatever status you have, whatever livelihood you have, you are now essentially considered criminals, and you are not only going to be detained, but you actually might be deported to a third country. We also know that there were those other migrants who were deported to Guantanamo Bay. The Venezuelans are essentially being used as this kind of horrific test case of how far the Donald Trump administration can go with dehumanizing migrants and completely criminalizing and taking away their fundamental human rights.
No, it's a great point. I mean, it's really, in many ways, a big-time extension of the Black Site program, right? You use these third-party countries to just disappear people, but now it's, not, a few hundred people. It seems like it's tens of thousands, at least, potentially, who are subject. And, I think for many people, Nayib Bukele is also getting something out of this, I think, in a material sense, but also just in terms of his profile. So I was hoping maybe you could talk about that a little bit. I mean, I guess he is relatively popular, but I think a lot of it is based on this sort of demagogy that I think he is using this, situation as well to bolster.
Yeah, definitely. Nayib Bukele has been kind of the favorite, the great example of the far right, both within Latin America and the Caribbean, and really on a global level. He has kind of taken forward this project of complete authoritarian rule, whether it's suspending Congress, whether it's essentially suspending the rule of law, establishing consecutive states of emergency to go after his war on the gangs, imprisoning over 60,000 people, I think, in the span of like a couple years in these massive prisons, which are now being used to detain immigrants. And so, of course, both sort of like liberal human rights advocates, but also, of course, people of the left have been heavily criticizing this policy of Nayib Bukele. And despite the fact that he has some degree of popularity because, of course, this policy of mass incarceration, was a populist and right-wing response to the very real issue of crime in El Salvador, which, of course, has a deep legacy in, not only the intervention of the U.S. in that country, the participation of the U.S. in the Civil War, many other factors which destabilize the country, collusion of the DEA with, for example, these drug trafficking groups, so many other things. But his response, again, has been to incarcerate tens of thousands of young people. Again, the far right has used this as an example. It's now called the Bukele model, essentially be tough on crime to the most extreme version of it. And he now is not only the poster child, but he's also using his model as, a profit-making tool. And so right now, receiving these Venezuelan migrants is what seems like it's going to be a long-term plan where El Salvador is paid to essentially incarcerate detained migrants. And what's very chilling about this is that being an immigrant, migrating is not a crime. You should not be held in indefinite detention in any case. But right now, people are being deported to El Salvador, being held in these high security detention centers, very, very difficult conditions, going to be subjected to hard labor, and there's no clear definition about how long do they stay there for. Will they be given a trial? What kind of trial can you be given in a third country? There's not like a U.S. court in El Salvador. So what does this actually mean? People want to go home. They do not want to be detained. And so this really opens up an entire new Pandora's box where there's just kind of no clear end in sight, but this model of mass incarceration, just, every single possible person that could be suspected of being a criminal receives that treatment. It's very, very concerning. And when you bring into it people being brought from one country to another, it kind of, again, it's uncharted waters right now, what we're seeing.
Zoe, real quick, I just wanted to ask you about one more thing, and that is the fact that, you mentioned that they're using the sort of Venezuelans as a test case. And there's a reason why Venezuelans specifically, in terms of there has been this media campaign in Spanish as well, in Spanish-speaking outlets as well, but also in the U.S., specifically geared against Venezuelan immigrants. And there's also just been this kind of like the fact that they got temporary protected status was seen as unfair. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of it? Because, I mentioned earlier going after the Palestine solidarity movement, it's because it's the most vulnerable thing to go after to achieve these other goals. So why specifically the Venezuelan migrants here?
Yeah, I think that the Donald Trump administration, despite liberals saying that he's stupid and he's a buffoon, is actually very calculated. And going after Venezuelan migrants has been a calculated move. And if you look back, the rhetoric that Trump was using during his campaign, the rhetoric that has been spewed on right-wing media outlets has been really targeting Venezuelan migrants in every way possible. So, for example, we know that we followed very closely the case of the apartment building in Aurora, where right-wing media, said that Venezuelan migrants were taking over this apartment complex and by extension, the entire city of Aurora. Part of the mass deportation drive is called Operation Aurora. Really like digging into this narrative that Venezuelans are criminals, that they're taking over the country. Very, very, little evidence to actually show for this, of course. But this has been a narrative that has been building for a while. They are extremely vulnerable as an immigrant community because on one hand, this is a very recent migration. If you look at, for example, the Mexican immigrant community, this is a community that has been migrating, for decades to the United States. There's very strong institutions. There's a lot of community support. There are organizations that have been formed. The Venezuelan migrant community, there has been historic migration, for example, at the beginning of the Bolivarian Revolution, when we saw a lot of people kind of flee Venezuela, maybe they were trying to protect their capital, but this sort of working class immigration that took place from Central America and Mexico into the United States is actually rather new for Venezuelans. So they don't have these strong networks of solidarity on one hand in the US to actually support them in this really challenging moment. But again, this right-wing campaign against them has been building for so long to depict them as criminals. There's been other incidents of, small incidents in New York. One person tried to steal a cell phone, and all of a sudden, all Venezuelans in New York are criminals. So what we're seeing right now is not an accident. Again, Donald Trump and the Donald Trump administration are trying out this strategy on, again, the weakest link, maybe the people that will receive the least support and solidarity. I mean, it remains to be seen how this is going to play out. But again, this was a very calculated move, criminalize them, stigmatize them, say that they are the reason that you don't have housing, the reason that you don't have jobs, the reason that there's more crime, all because of the Venezuelan migrants. And then, wow, what a surprise. They're the people who are, dehumanized, deported to another country, and then maybe sent into forced labor. So it's really important, I think, right now to highlight these elements and make sure that this, atrocious act and deep kind of violation of, so many different fundamental human rights doesn't go unnoticed and doesn't go unchallenged because, again, it's a test case to expand this and who knows really what direction this could go in the future.
Well, as always, Zoe Alexandra, editor of People's Dispatch, thank you for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me.